$387 million worldwide its opening weekend. Well, that film has quickly become the top grossing film in history by an African-American director and featuring a predominantly African-American cast. Well, calls for Russia's sanctions to be enforced after getting louder here after the latest indictment of 13 Russians in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into meddling in the 2016 election. Here is Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu.
This is serious, and the best way to respond is to, first of all, impose the bipartisan congressional sanctions that Congress passed last year. President Trump has yet to do that. Instead, he's launched a series of desperate-sounding, unhinged tweets.
Evan McMullin is back with me, along with Noelle Nikpour and Jason Johnson. Evan, we talked a little bit about this at the top of the show. You said sanctions are incredibly important here.
Right.
How does what happened on Friday, that indictment, all that it detailed, being handed up to the Justice Department, what does that do to change this conversation about sanctions?
Well, I think, first of all, it makes much more tangible what the Russians did and the Russia investigation to the American people. I mean, in the past, we sort of had a declassified report from the intelligence agencies that said Russia did this to us, but it didn't go into that much detail about how, especially not details that most Americans, if they don't come from that background, can really get their heads around. The indictment paperwork, the indictment details tactics that Americans can understand. They can understand social media and how you could use social media to manipulate people and what trolls are doing, because we all see them online every day. And so it makes it much more tangible. And I think, I think that makes it harder for the president to push back, to say that it's all a hoax. It makes it harder for him to fire Mueller or Rosenstein, although I still think they're at risk. But it does change the conversation for that purpose, for those purposes.
Noelle, I'll ask you about the White House's response to this. Evan talks about how lucidly the case is laid out in that indictment. We don't have a real lucid explanation from this White House or this president about why these sanctions haven't been implemented. You heard Ted Lieu there. Is that going to change, do you think?
Right. And, to go a step further and beyond this, the pressure is really on for the White House and for Donald Trump to impose sanctions. And I'll tell you why. The world is watching. Because if we're weak on that, if they have meddled in our elections, Mueller has found 13 people that did it. This sends a signal to the world of, go ahead. We're not going to do anything about it. This was huge. And while, some people say it didn't affect the election, what's going to happen next time when it does affect the election? And we've got midterms coming up. This is not a laughable matter. So you can look at it as, something in the United States. But other countries are watching, and they're wanting to say, what's the punishment for meddling in the U.S. elections? So we better do something about it. And I'm not so concerned about what the president's tweeting as much as I am his actions. What's he going to do? Is he going to implement sanctions? And the second part of it is, are the sanctions going to be strong enough to get the attention of the world?
Jason, let's stick with this. The crucible for this conversation has been this Munich Security Conference. We heard from Sergei Kislyak, the former ambassador to the U.S. We heard from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. The Kremlin released this statement about that indictment. There are no indications that the Russian state could have any involvement in this, and there can't be. What's the messaging, to take Noelle's point here, of who's being called out and who isn't here? You got the president not calling out Russia directly. That's a loud, resounding message worldwide.
Right. So Russia has basically said, yeah, we did it. And we're going to lie about it. We're going to lie to your face. It doesn't matter what America says. We're going to keep doing this to every single country we can get our hands on. And the United States is either impotent or feckless and incapable of doing anything about it. This is what makes this dangerous, not just sort of domestically, but as an international issue. Everyone does this. I think it's always important to remember. The United States manipulates elections. The British manipulate. Everybody does this. But the level that the Russians are going to at America is where this becomes a problem. When you start making fake PayPal accounts and stealing people's Social Security numbers and getting into identity theft in order to promote one candidate or another, that's when it gets dangerous. That's when, look, all you got to do is send the right phishing email to somebody in the middle of Indiana, forget to carry the 4, and suddenly a congressperson loses 15,000 votes because those people aren't in the right district. That's what we're facing. And for the president to basically say, well, I guess I believe Putin and what he says, we're not going to do anything, it endangers our democracy.
All right, Jason, Noelle, Evan, thanks to you very much. Up next, we'll mention